Hundreds of Russian soldiers are reportedly surrounded in Ukraine as both sides blitz each other's energy infrastructure. And in good news for Kyiv, America has said it is fast-tracking Patriot missiles to Ukraine.
Kyiv again, this is a swing and yet. We're in Kyiv again.
My name is Jerome Starkey. I'm the defence editor at The Sun newspaper, and this is Frontline, your weekly roundup of the most important news from the war in Ukraine. We'll start with what's happening in Vovchansk. That is the town at the epicentre of Russia's Kharkiv offensive, the offensive in northeastern Ukraine, where they opened a new front by invading from neighbouring Belgorod. There are reports that Ukraine has managed to isolate a group of about 400 Russian soldiers in a chemical plant on the edge of that town, and dozens of them have surrendered. These reports have been emerging slowly, I should say, and it's not exactly clear how many of those soldiers remain fighting, how many of those soldiers have been captured, but nonetheless, footage showing devastation in Vovchansk, footage showing small numbers of Russian soldiers surrendering, some seen surrendering in the field, others seen as prisoners of war in footage released by Ukraine's armed forces. It is nonetheless clear evidence that that assault in Kharkiv has become bogged down. Ukraine today said there will be longer rolling electricity blackouts after the most recent wave of overnight Russian missile attacks. Russia launched at least 9 cruise missiles. Ukraine said 5 of them were shot down, as well as all 27 Shahid one-way attack drones, those are the Iranian drones, all shot down. But nonetheless, the missiles that got through reportedly causing substantial damage to Ukraine's energy infrastructure, which has been taking hits on a very regular basis from Russia. Ukraine at the same time hitting back with what appear to be drone strikes on at least 2, possibly 3 oil depots deep inside Russia, one in Tambov, so northeast of Ukraine in the direction, sort of in the direction of Moscow, another in Krasnodar, much closer to Ukrainian-held territory, Krasnodar just east of Kerch, so east of the easternmost tip of occupied Ukraine. These attacks continue to be one of the most sort of fiercely fought fronts in this campaign, both sides attempting to do 2 slightly different things. Russia, it would seem, trying to break the will of Ukraine to fight by plunging people into cold and darkness in the coming winter, but by crippling Ukraine's energy and hot water infrastructure. And we saw that really from the first winter of the war. We're now 2.5 years in, and this campaign has been sustained across this summer. Previously, Russia's attacks on energy infrastructure were focused in the autumn leading up to the winter, those winter months. It would also have, and perhaps a likely ambition of Russia, this would also have an impact on Ukraine's manufacturing capability if Russia can limit the electricity supply, effectively forcing factories to close, potentially munitions factories, which are, as Ukraine tries to rebuild its sovereign, its domestic arms capability. Ukraine's ambition is slightly different. It has been targeting refineries and depots, oil depots, to degrade Russia's ability to wage war by hitting 2 things. One, simply by removing the fuel that Russia needs to fuel its armed forces, to keep its vehicles in the fight, but crucially on a sort of more bigger scale, degrading the Russian economy, crippling its ability to refine oil and gas being a huge source of income to the Russian economy. And at its peak, there were suggestions that Ukraine had damaged about 10% of Russia's oil refining capabilities. Those strikes continue. An interesting report out today from the British Ministry of Defence looking at what Russia has been doing with its Air Force strikes, suggesting that it has changed its focus in a window between the 12th and the 18th of June from, instead of hitting frontline Russian positions with its Air Force, hitting Ukrainian airfields. So moving from hitting sort of frontline military positions to hitting Ukrainian airfields further behind the front line for a 6-day window from the 12th to the 18th of June. important for two reasons. The British Defence Intelligence says this is likely a response to successful Ukrainian attacks against Russian air defence batteries in occupied Crimea. Ukraine has hit several, including key parts of the S-300 and S-400 air defence systems, Russia's most sophisticated air defence systems. Of course, when they are degraded, that leaves other assets vulnerable. But also, this focus on airfields may well be a sign of Russian concern about the imminent arrival of the US-made F-16 fighter jets. 4 countries have said that they will provide Ukraine with F-16s, and the first of those, we believe, from Denmark, are due to arrive any day, and they will rely on upgraded Ukrainian airfields to operate. Finally, today, we couldn't do this update with talking about where Vladimir Putin has been strutting around Pyongyang, the capital of North Korea, alongside its dictator Kim Jong-un. Vladimir Putin has made his first visit to North Korea for 24 years, where he said that he had signed an agreement, a strategic agreement with North Korea, which in his own words was a deliberate attempt to upend the US-led world order. Now, we understand that this agreement, while full details have not been released, includes a mutual defense pact. President Kim Jong-un suggesting that this was the strongest treaty these two countries have ever signed, and that it would cement friendly relations between Russia and North Korea for 100 years. Now, what does this mean for the war in Ukraine? Now, theoretically, a mutual defense pact could mean that if Russia faces aggression from, as it is, it's in a war with Ukraine, that Ukraine is being aided by its Western partners. In theory, that allows North Korea to send potentially its troops or certainly its resources to assist Russia. North Korea has already been doing that. At least it's already been sending missiles. It's been sending vast quantities of dumb munitions, heavy artillery shells, and these have been vital for Russian forces. What is North Korea getting in exchange? Well, that is not quite as clear, but there are concerns that what Pyongyang wants is food, energy, and crucially, access to advanced Russian rocket technology to advance Kim Jong-un's nuclear ambitions and space ambitions. There have been a series of failed missile launches by North Korea. Many experts believe that what North Korea really wants is access to some of Russia's know-how. Vladimir Putin was feted by extraordinary scenes in Pyongyang. Thousands of people turned out to greet him as the two presidents drove through the capital standing through the sunroof of a Mercedes limousine, many of them waving flowers and flags in sort of coordinated ritual dancing. His portrait and Kim's portrait, vast portraits hanging off buildings festooned in banners in the country, in the colours of the two countries' flags, very reminiscent of sort of the Stalinist era communist parades of times gone by. One amusing anecdote that does appear to have emerged, though, today was of a scene where a number of Russian ministers, including the new defense minister, including Russia's foreign minister Sergei Shoigu, were ejected from a meeting room by North Korean officials because they appeared to have breached protocol by going into that room ahead of Presidents Kim and Putin, and North Korean officials unhappy about that. The meeting was being broadcast live, and as reported by the Moscow Times, they were ushered out, much to the chagrin of those Russian officials. Today, Vladimir Putin is continuing his diplomatic tour with a visit to Vietnam. That likely to be less significant in terms of what Vietnam might provide Russia in terms of the resources it needs, the weapons, the chips and equipment that it needs to continue prosecuting its war in Ukraine. But nonetheless, this is part of a broader and deliberate Russian strategy to try and coalesce an international bloc of nations which are pro-Russian, anti-Western, and to try and challenge what the West describes as the rule-based order, what Vladimir Putin describes as US hegemony. As ever, if you've got any questions, please do ask them in the comments below, and we will do our best to answer them next week. The questions from last week really focused around Russia's nuclear threats. You remember we were talking about Putin's nuclear saber-rattling and tactical nuclear drills. The question that occurred most was, should we take these threats seriously? The short answer is we have to. Russia is a nuclear power. It is waging a war against its neighbor, and Vladimir Putin and many of his senior lieutenants and aides continue to make a number of nuclear threats. They range from the explicit to the oblique, but nonetheless, given the consequences, the potential devastation, catastrophic consequences of a nuclear strike, it is impossible not to take them seriously. But at the same time, it is impossible not to grow slightly fatigued, slightly weary as these threats continue to be made. They've been made over the course of the last 2.5 years, fairly frequently, but they have not been acted upon, much to the relief, clearly, of the rest of the world. Question number 2 is, what would happen, what would the West do if Russia did launch a tactical nuclear weapon? Now, certainly in the United Kingdom, there is a deliberate policy of nuclear ambiguity in terms of how and when the United Kingdom would launch its nuclear weapons, and more widely, this policy of ambiguity across the West is a deliberate policy so as not to bind countries, including the United States and NATO, into a set course of action in order to leave its opponents, like Russia, uncertain of how it might respond. So that is to say, if Russia launched a tactical nuclear weapon in or near Ukraine, there is no guarantee that that would necessarily elicit a nuclear response from a nuclear power or NATO. What we do know is that, and this was reported by The Sun at the time and reported more recently by the Financial Times, that the closest we understand that the world has come to a nuclear confrontation during this war in Ukraine was one weekend in October 2022, when Russian forces were collapsing both in the northeastern Kharkiv front and in southern Kherson. We understand that, well, at the time we knew that Britain's then Defence Secretary Ben Wallace flew to America for urgent talks with his US counterparts. Subsequently, it has emerged in reporting in the Financial Times that what this crisis point led to was a clearer understanding of the mechanisms of escalation and also the mechanisms of de-escalation, how the West should respond. And part of that response involved communicating very clearly and urgently with other powers in the world, with China and with India, persuading them to exert pressure on Putin to step back from the brink. My understanding was that a Western response would likely involve, or Western messaging to Russia suggested that a response would involve a huge escalation from the West in their support for Ukraine. So were Putin to use a tactical nuclear weapon, Ukraine's partners would spectacularly ramp up their support and involvement in the war in order to defeat Russia, but that is not to say that there would be a nuclear response. Thank you for watching. If you do have any questions, please ask them in the comments below, and we'll do our best to answer some of them next week.